the Galatians, or the multiple churches of the Galatian region, in terms of there was people trying to change the gospel that had presented to them in the past as they were established as churches. And we see here, and we're going to see here in later chapters even more, we see in other epistles, especially in 1 Corinthians, that Paul is zealous for the gospel, for the truth of God's word, especially the gospel, because that's the basis for our belief and for our salvation. And he steadfastly defends it. And even the whole book of Galatians is an apologetic or a defense of that gospel, because he's establishing how important it is. We talked about how there's some things that are gray area doctrine, and different people might believe different things, but when it comes to the gospel, to the understanding of the fact that we're sinners and that Jesus, as God, was here on earth for the distinct purpose of going to the cross and dying to pay for our sins, giving us a new life, a different relationship with God than we had before. He's fighting against it being changed at all. And while Judaizers aren't mentioned here, we see Jewish leaders and groups of Jews in the book of Acts following Paul and trying to disrupt his work and attacking him. And we see by his writings how they're trying to inject the law and a lot of the things that Judaism is based on into Christianity or into the gospel. And he's fighting hard against that. So as we get to, we'll go back to verse 10 and start there, because the first chapter is broken into a few sections, and 10 to 12 is a section that's going to show us Paul's focus. And then verses 13 to the end of the chapter, some people see it as a defense of Paul's ministry, but I really look at it more as Paul giving us some background, which helps explain or helps us to understand the rest of the epistle, because Paul's background or what he not only went through, but what he's looking to do is integral to that understanding. So verse 10 starts out, "For am I now seeking the favor of men or of God?" I'm just going to read the first 3 verses, then we'll go through them one at a time. "Or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant or a slave of Christ. For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but through a revelation of Jesus Christ." Certainly we know the story of Paul's conversion. He's going to go into in just the next few verses who he was, not who he is. He'll do that too, but who he was, and that's critical to what's happened and what is happening. But here he's talking about his focus, what's important in his focus. Do I seek to please men? The reason he's talking about that is not only to show us where his focus is, but to show us what's going on. And we can see that even today. You flip through channels as you're seeing all sorts of television, religious personalities, preaching. But a lot of the messages are really social gospels or things that are watered down. They're meant to be pleasing to men. They're talking about things that wouldn't be offensive. I might have mentioned it last week. It certainly was on my mind, has been on my mind for a while. But there's times you hear people talking and God could be a subject, but Jesus a lot of times isn't. And the reason for that is you can talk about God with anybody and it's not offensive, because the thought of God really spans different religions and it can be generic if you allow it to be, but once you inject Jesus into the mix, it's no longer generic. It no longer spans the different religions. It's very specific, and it points to the fact that we're sinful, and in that sin we're separated from a holy and a righteous God, and that we needed something other than we could provide to make us right before God, and Jesus is that provision. And obviously Jesus is very specific about that when he says he's the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father but by him. But that can become offensive as you start. But I even hear Christians a lot of times willing to talk about God, but not always being willing to bring Jesus into the mix, because that really puts the focus on it. And that's what Paul's talking about here. Am I seeking favor of men? When I'm going out and talking about God, when I'm going out and trying to teach people and trying to bring them to God, am I looking to please men in my doing that? Am I looking to be non-offensive? Am I looking to say things that tickle but don't really, make you dig, that don't make you think badly of yourself, that make you think good, that make you think better things are there to come, that, we might not have to go through hard times to show our faith and our belief. Am I pleasing men, or am I looking to please God? God wanted it to, Paul wanted it to be known that his focus was on pleasing God. And the message that he was going to be bringing, the gospel, wasn't one that was going to tickle people's ears. It was going to be full force about what Jesus did for us and what's necessary for us to do to be right before God. And the Judaizers, and that's what was going on in Galatia, was people were trying to compromise and be allowing different things. The Judaizers still wanted the law in play here, and the law can't be in play. Paul's going to talk about that later. He talks about it in other epistles. The law had its purpose, but Jesus fulfilled the law. And now, for our standpoint, is it that we're to disregard the things that God's put out as things we're supposed to do? No, but the law isn't set out there for us to try to attain, because not for our righteousness, at least, because we can't. And that's what Jews of that time were trying to do. The law was something they used to set a standard to show their righteousness, and it doesn't really do that. It shows your need for God's grace and mercy. So Paul here isn't looking to please men in what he's saying. He's looking to please God. And he goes to the point in the second part of that verse. He says, if I was still trying to please men, and he says still trying. So Paul, and he's going to go through that in that last 13 through 24, he's going to go through that. He was trying to please man in his acting out of ignorance, as he says in another epistle, in his seeking to persecute the Christian church for the perceived blasphemies and stuff. He was trying to please man, not please God. And he's, it's important that, Paul's mindset was different than it is now, because he didn't understand God the way that God helped him to understand them. But he says, if I were looking to please men, I wouldn't be a bondservant or a slave. That word, some Bibles say bondservant, some say slave, but it really is slave. It has a much stronger meaning when you use the word slave. Paul's ministry wasn't directed toward pleasing man. It was directed toward pleasing God. It was about showing men God. It was about bringing men to God. So he's very specific there, and he's setting the stage in talking about this, and then he's going to go into his life. He's setting the stage for the later things to come in the chapter. In verse 11, it says, for I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. So now he's going to say whose message it is. It isn't his message. It isn't a message that he learned. And this was different than, say, everybody else. How do we learn about Jesus? How did we learn about the need for salvation? How did we learn about the fact that that God's real and he cares about us and loves us. It was through somebody else. We learned about it through man, through some other men, but Paul didn't. Paul's revelation came directly from Jesus. And it's important to understand how he received it, because God was changing him from one who was zealous of the law and protecting that law and protecting Jewish ways and traditions to one who's looking to be a slave for God, and one who's going to be sharing the word that God's given him. So 12 finishes up that thought. For I neither received it from a man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And, we understand the dramatic way that Paul received the gospel. He's on the road to Damascus looking to persecute the Christian church in Acts, and he encounters Jesus, and he's totally changed. There wasn't a need for him to, and he's going to talk about this a little bit. And he's not going to go into the road to Damascus, but he's going to go into what happened to him and the changes that have been made in him. But just think about that. He's on the road to Damascus looking to persecute Christians, to put them in jail, to kill them, because he sees them as blasphemers to the Jewish religion, to the law. And Jesus stops him dead in his tracks. And Paul has a conversion there because he's face to face with Jesus. That's something that's not going to happen to us until we're called home, one way or the other. And what a change it's going to be. The Bible tells us that there's going to be a tremendous change in us when we see him as he is. Right now we're seeing in a glass darkly. We have a veiled image of Jesus, a veiled image of God, of the things that God's done for us and what he has for us. And that's why we struggle with it. But there's going to come a day where we're going to be face to face with God and with Jesus. And we're going to be changed in a way that we probably can't even understand now, but it's going to be glorious. It's something to look forward to. It's something that, to be anxious about. We want it. And it's something to fuel us here and now. But Paul got to see that, and it took him from where he was as a Pharisee, as a zealous Jew, to somebody who was on fire for God, looking to share Jesus and the gospel and to keep the churches on the straight and narrow path that they were supposed to be on. So he receives the gospel in a dramatic, direct revelation when he encounters Jesus, and it changes his life. He becomes a slave. I'm going to take a little break there if anybody has any comments.
Yeah, I particularly agree with how you speak of Paul as how he speaks of himself as a servant for Christ. He classifies himself, characterizes himself as a slave. I don't think any of us here would want to call ourselves a slave to anybody or anything. Particularly given the history of the country, nobody likes to use that term. But here the term is a very positive one. Paul does not see himself in any way deprived as being a servant or a slave to Christ. In fact, he sees that as a very liberating thing and a very freeing thing. And, it raised him up. You mentioned how Paul had been the persecutor of the church. He goes from being probably the worst persecutor that we see in history, in the early church, to being the greatest servant of Christ and promoter of the gospel. So what 180 degrees the Lord takes Paul from, even changing his name. And you go back to Acts chapter 9 when Paul is, he's first converted and I think it's Ananias, puts his hands on him. Paul receives the Holy Spirit in Damascus. The first thing he does is go and preach. No hesitation. He goes and preaches, and you have to admire the man for his zeal for the Lord. And I think that's something that, by and large, the church today needs to find again. It needs to rediscover that zeal, and not be afraid of the criticism of the world or the how we might be observed by others, politically correct and those kind of things. But, to step right out there and to be so zealous, even in a situation where he was in Damascus and the Jews were waiting in the gate of the city to tackle him and kill him when they saw him. So they lower him over the wall in a basket. I mean, this guy is not going to be afraid. He's going to take every opportunity he can, first of all, to preach, and second of all, to escape the hands of those who want to destroy him and stop him. And the Lord wouldn't let him be touched until the time when it was necessary for him to go to Rome. But, you're mentioning how Paul was very zealous for the law. And, and that's understandable from his background as a Pharisee. But, it says in verse 13 that in the Jews' religion, how he beyond measure persecuted the church. He profited in the Jews' religion in verse 14. It's interesting how he doesn't say in the Lord's law or the Lord or God's ways or God's commands. He says the Jews' religion. What they had done with God's law was to turn it into something that God hadn't intended. I was reading a devotional this morning that I got, and it spoke about that very thing, what you're talking about, Sean. And it spoke about the what they term the, if I pronounce it right, the halakha, which is the teaching of the Jews about the law and the expanding of the law with all of the ordinances that they added to it and the requirements and all of that went along with their zeal to uphold the law. But it wasn't the law as much as it was all the things they added to it. And I think Paul, he came out of that and said, no, this is all just absolutely unnecessary. So I think that, you're spot on with it, Sean, about that. And I think that Paul was, it was the law, and then it was all the things that they unnecessarily added to the law, because when you add to the law, you take away from the picture that it presents of Christ. Even in the law, Christ is preached, all the Old Testament. And I think that's what Paul was really driving at, that they were missing out on Christ because they were so zealous for the law and adding to the law in their zeal. But Paul just wanted to be zealous for Christ, the gospel, simplify it, and last week I couldn't remember, and I should have been smart enough to know that it was right here where it was mentioned that he was 3 years in Arabia. I kept thinking that's in Acts, but it's not. It's here, and Paul doesn't mention it until now. But, he had direct teaching from Christ, just like all the other apostles. 3 years with the Lord. And you think about the value in that. If you could take a 3-year leave of absence from your job and spend that time with Christ, face to face, in person, in the flesh, and just listen to everything he has to tell you. I mean, which one of us would say, no, I can't do that? What a wonderful opportunity that would be, and we're going to have that forever.
Yeah.
Can't wait.
I also like what you said, Sean, about Paul keeping his focus, right? That he said in verse 10 that he does not persuade men, but he tries to persuade God or please God. And I was thinking also of what you said, Nick, about being a bondservant, right? Paul knows that he's a free man, pretty much, even though he's a believer. He's a follower of Christ, and he makes that clear in Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians, in chapter 9, in verse 19, he says, "For though I am free from all men, I made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more." Right, and then he goes into saying that to the Jew he became a Jew, to the ones who are under the law he also became under the law, and to those who are weak he also became weak, that he might save some. Right, so he's not compromising the gospel, but he is, I guess, he's changing himself to get into that culture, to get into that group of people, so that he can bring the gospel to them. And I think that's also important for us, that I have a lot of friends who are unbelievers. Some of them are atheists, some of them are Catholics. They don't really practice, but I'm still considering them friends. And I don't participate in you know in the things that they do sometimes in like bad things or whatever. But at the end of the day, that is an opportunity for me to also try to give the gospel to them, uh, and you know just like relating to them in that sense, and whether you know it is something cultural or something like a meal or something like that. At the end of the day, I think we're called to compromise in that sense. Like even if we don't like certain a type of food, we can still go and participate into that as long as we are uh, being away from sin, but at the same time bringing the gospel to them.
That's a good point, Jorge. We're to love man. We're to be a testimony to them. Doesn't mean that we have to do things that would reflect badly on God. We shouldn't be doing that. But you can be friends with sinners. Jesus was, or friends with people who don't get it yet. Jesus was, and help them along that path to God. Sometimes it's hard to do that, to try to walk that line for some people maybe, but we're to be an influence to the world. And Paul was being that, and that's part of what he's doing here in explaining different things. So as we see the next portion, verses 13 through 24, this is seen a couple of different ways. With a lot of commentators, they're talking about all these things that are happening on the outside to cause this portion to be written, like Paul being attacked, his apostleship being attacked, his right to be telling the church what to do being attacked. There is some basis for that. If you're looking at Acts, there's nothing that comes out and says this directly, especially in relation to the epistle to the Galatians. But as we look at Acts, Paul was certainly attacked, and there were people who were questioning his authority and attacking everything he said and trying to cause bodily harm to him. So it could make sense that that's something that comes out as people try to dig in and complete a story, and we don't always have the complete stories. But you can also take a simple approach, and that's kind of what I do. Here, there's obvious things that are coming out of these last 11 or 12 verses. Part of it is a background. Paul's establishing his background and what happened in his life. He's not going into tremendous detail, but he's going to be writing about other things in the next 5 chapters in this epistle to the Galatians, and they have some really strong theological points, and he's establishing things to back that up. So a lot of this is helping to build the rest of the epistle. A lot of this background that he's establishing, it is his creds, giving him credibility in terms of what he's going to be saying later, because he did meet Jesus on the road to Damascus. He did spend time studying the word with God as his teacher, not man, and taking all that tremendous knowledge that he had of the Old Testament and having it translated to what it really meant. Again, we might not understand that because we've grown up with both Old Testament and New Testament, and we have some of the explanation of what the Old Testament means, and we could see it in the context of Jesus and of salvation and of new covenant and of grace and mercy. But if you talk to somebody who's Jewish, they don't see any of that because they don't have that additional context. But Paul and the rest of the apostles were Jewish, and they did have that ability to look back at the Old Testament and see what God really had for them as Christians and us as Christians. So he's going to be explaining, why, what happened to him, and that's going to help build the rest of the epistle. So in 13 and 14, he says, "For you have heard of my former manner of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. And we'll stop there for a moment. This says a whole bunch about who Paul was and about why he was doing before his conversion on the road to Damascus, why he was doing what he was doing. Paul's credentials as a zealous Jew were beyond doubt. The people of that time knew who he was as a zealous Jew. You heard of my former manner of life in Judaism. He was a Pharisee. He had been taught at the feet of Gamaliel. He knew the Old Testament inside and out, and he was political enough to have risen through the ranks and been at the top. And on top of that, he was zealous for the law. He was going around persecuting Christians because they were teaching that the law wasn't the end all anymore. And so he says, and Nick had pointed it out before, that not only was he persecuting beyond measure and trying to destroy the church, but he was using it, or maybe he wasn't using it, but it was giving him fame and renown in Judaism. He said, I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen. He was moving up. He was among the top. Just think of the impact of that conversion on the Jews, on the Jewish leaders of that time. That's why they were attacking him. That's why they were following him from place to place. That's why they were trying to infiltrate, even the ones who were, maybe seeing Christianity as a sect of Judaism, because that's how it was really seen early on. And it was mixed in the temple. They were trying to infiltrate it and change things. But he says, I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. So just what he's seeing now in Galatia, that's who he was. Here's people trying to keep Jewish tradition alive, even within the church. And do we know if they're Christians or not Christians? We don't know. The ones who were Jews were attacking. The ones who were Christians or borderline were infiltrating. They were just trying to change things to make it more to their liking, but that means they didn't get it. They didn't understand what God had for them all along. They didn't understand what the law was leading them toward. They didn't understand what the Old Testament was pointing to in terms of Messiah not just being the king who would conquer, but being the one who would pay for sin. And Paul says he was that person beforehand, being extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. That's the law and circumcision and all those things that we see in other epistles that are being brought out by Christian Jews as of necessary even for being a Christian. Yes, we need to believe in Jesus, but we also need to follow the law. Yes, we need to believe in Jesus, but we also need to be circumcised. Works still are important. Have we heard that in this day and age? Sure. It gets watered down a bit, but that's still out there, where Jesus, it isn't only Jesus. It's us doing something too. Well, Paul's saying the gospel is that Jesus died for sin. That's the gospel. And he was buried and he rose again and he was seen by many. There's nothing else that has to be added to that. And Paul is as zealous about the gospel as he was zealous about Jewish traditions. God saw something, and we're going to get into that. But God knew something about Paul that not only made him a good Jew or a great Jew, would make him a good Christian or a great Christian. Sometimes the difference between good and bad is a very fine line. And fortunately, God knows everything about us. So 15 starts with a but. I like buts in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, because it's going to bring an emphasis to something, and And it's kind of changing course a little bit, but it's really more of an emphasis here. It says, but when it pleased God, or when God had set me apart from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, was pleased. So God was pleased, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his son in me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles. And we'll stop there for a minute. So there was a time when it pleased God to stop Paul in his tracks. Paul had a lot of great qualities to him, and it made him a great Jew. But God's plan for him wasn't for him to be a great Jew, but to be a slave to God, preaching the gospel, establishing churches, saving many, bringing people to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And it was really just an about face in Paul's understanding of God that took all those characteristics and talents and gifts and put them on the right track. God can do that. We can't do that very well. And people try to do that. Self-help books to do everything. We try to do that with ourselves all the time, retrain ourselves and try to make us into something different than we are. But God can do that. Paul had all these things in him that, when directed correctly, made him a slave to God. That was a tremendous worker for God. So that verse 15 says, but when God was pleased to have set me apart from my mother's womb. So that also, we can go into a lot of other things there. We're not going to, at least not right now. But God knew Paul from before he was even born, from before that spark of life. God knows who we are. God knows what we're all about. God knows what we're going to do. That's why people get into so many arguments about predestination and things like that. I don't know that that's a worthwhile argument, but we're not going to worry about that for now. But it is true that God knew Paul even back before he was born. And he knew Paul's life even back before he was born. He knew Paul's characteristics and his zealousness and his interest in God's word, maybe not in the way that it should have been, but he knew all that. And he knew with one change, and that change was Paul's perspective of God, that Paul would be a totally different man, useful in tremendous ways to God. And what did he go? He went from verse 14, or actually verse 13, persecuting the church of God beyond measure and trying to destroy it, to verse 16, pleased to reveal his son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles. Paul went from persecuting the church to being the prime spokesman for the church, all because he saw Jesus. What a tremendous impact Jesus has on our lives. And it's going to be greater when we get to see him, but he has that impact anyway. And here he had that impact on Paul. Paul changed and based on God's direction. So Paul has a separation here. He's being set apart. He was that word Pharisee means to be set apart too. There's a separation in being a Pharisee. You're being separated to something, but Paul's being set apart here also for God. And it's interesting to note, and Nick brought this up also, and I had been thinking about this already, that Paul doesn't immediately jump in and start to do stuff in the church. How many people are saved, people of tremendous intelligence and great knowledge, and they're saved, and all of a sudden they're writing books and they're guest speakers, and they're out there in front of everybody right away. But Paul didn't do that. the apostles had those 3 years of being with Jesus to mature and to really get it, to understand the differences between what they've been taught their whole lives and what God really had for them, to get the understanding of who Messiah really was and what was going to happen and what it was going to accomplish, to actually see him in the flesh, but then see him die and then see him resurrected again. There's so much power in all that. So Paul, as the leader of the Jews in Jerusalem, could have jumped right in and said, I already know all this stuff, but he didn't. In verse 17, he says, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. And then 3 years later, and we're going to stop there. So he spent 3 years in Syria, maybe Damascus and Antioch, 3 years in Asia Minor, which is what I believe that Arabia was. It's not Saudi Arabia as we know it, but I think it's the lower part of Turkey or Asia Minor that he's talking about. So he didn't jump right out in there and start doing things, but he set himself apart to God, probably to be taught by God, as Nick said, to have things kind of gel in him. So he understood the difference between all the teaching that he had in Judaism. He knew the Old Testament inside and out, but he didn't really know the Old Testament because he didn't understand it the way God was going to reveal it to him. Just as he didn't understand God the way God really was. He thought he had an obligation to live according to the law, according to the traditions, to be zealous according to them. And really they were his God. He didn't understand a God who was interactive and wanted obedience and wanted recognition. He was giving that to the law. And all of a sudden he meets Jesus face to face and his understanding of God totally changes. And now he's got to go back and relearn everything he knew, learn it from a different perspective. And he does that. He doesn't just jump in, say, okay, I was a Pharisee, I was a leader, I can be a leader here too. I already know more than most of the apostles in terms of the Old Testament. We don't know what he said or thought, but obviously by not going up to Jerusalem and not going to the apostles, but going to Arabia first, that was probably at God's direction, but it was so God could give him that understanding of his word with a new perspective. I'm going to stop there for a second if anybody wants to jump in.
Just thinking about someone we were saying, Sean, Paul knew the Old Testament in and out. He was an expert. He was probably the equivalent of a double PhD today. That's the way I've heard it described. And the Lord knocked him down on the road to Damascus. I mean, you made a good point. The Lord stopped him dead in his tracks from the direction he was going in and turned him around, basically. I wonder if the Lord waited until Paul had learned all that he could about the old covenant, about what he thought was right. And that's when the Lord decided to start using him at that point, because then Paul would be in a great position to use all of that great knowledge that you described so well, so he could use it to make it true to the Jews about Christ, to bring it out to them in a way that they could understand it according to what they already knew. Because if maybe years earlier Paul wouldn't have been as good at it, and maybe he wouldn't have known as much. I don't know if that makes sense. The Lord does everything in the right time.
Mm-hmm.
He never makes a mistake. He never gets it wrong. So I just think about, Paul was really at the right place at the right time with the right knowledge, of the old covenant to do the work that the Lord wanted him to do as a believer. Does that make any sense? That's a question I'm asking.
Yeah, I think it does. Time is gone. So we have Mark next week. And then we'll be back in Galatians 1 the week after. And I think we're going to go back to 16 and start from there. There's a couple of points I still want to make, but I don't want to push time too far. It'll take a while to make some points. Anybody have any last thoughts before we close?
No, but I have a bit of a prayer request. I forgot to mention it earlier.
Sure.
You think about it. I got a phone call today